Okay, so the pre-context is everything that happens before units 1 through 6, but it's still important to know because it sets the stage for everything else that's going to happen in the future. And so it focuses on a time period about 10,000 BCE, before the Common Era, all the way up to 600 CE, Common Era. Some major changes during this time were nomadic movements, migration, farming and agriculture, as well as the expansion and the contraction of civilization. So how empires grew, as well as how some empires fell apart. The earliest grouping that we're going to talk about has to do with nomads during the Paleolithic period. So what you need to know about them: their sole focus in life was limited to surviving. So food and shelter, and that's pretty much it. Don't die was their daily motto. They had to worry about the elements around them constantly, for fear that they or their families were going to be at risk, and so they had no tools, no farming. Follow the food was pretty much it, and we know very little about them because they didn't leave a written record behind. Everything we know from archaeologists who dug up the remains and then figured out what was important to these groups and these civilizations based on what was buried with them. The Neolithic Revolution is the new revolution. Neo means new, and so it's considered new because you do see the development of a couple of things. You see the creation of spoken language, so people can now communicate with each other. You see the use and control of fire, which is really, really important as far as technology goes. Yes, it's considered technology because technology is anything that makes your life easier. And so fire was extremely important because it allowed them to cook their food. Better food meant better diets and nutrition, meant they lived longer. It also was a defense tool because it allowed them to see in the dark, but it also allowed them to warn off other predators as well. Then they see early types of rudimentary or basic stone tools, pretty much just used for digging up roots because they were hunter-gatherers, but also some early forms of weaponry also. So the pictures: early family unit, small, very, very limited to probably just the immediate family members and anybody who was useful to the group. You had to be useful, if not, you were probably going to be sent away. The other one is a cave drawing of the Chauvet cave that was discovered in France. They put it at about 25,000 years ago. It showed a depiction of what we talked about in class being like a hunt, because we can see some animals being predators versus prey, and even these early humans were trying to show us what was happening in their daily lives. And then the very last picture is from a Grecian urn of Prometheus. So the story of Prometheus was that he was a titan. He stole fire from the gods and he gave it to humans. That was important because at the time it's what separated them from us. It's what made them greater than us. And so Zeus, king of the gods, saw this as a huge betrayal and forced Prometheus to be chained to a mountain where he had his liver eaten out every day, and then it would grow back at night, and the same process would happen again and again and again for the rest of eternity, as his punishment for betraying the gods and stealing fire for us. Early human migration is marked by this map that you guys can see here. Basically, all humans, or early humans, came out of the same area and territory about 100,000 years ago in East Africa. The different arrows show you the trajectory, or the way in which we went, or how we migrated. So from Africa to Europe, then to Asia. Some people went south to Australia. Some people continued further and went across. The Bering Strait at one point was frozen over, and it connected North America to the rest of the world, particularly Asia. So it was like this big giant ice bridge where people could walk across and walk over, and then from walking across from Asia to North America, they would eventually travel south to different parts of the world as well. However, at some point, because of climate change, that ice bridge melted, and then people were pretty much separated. We didn't know people were living in the Americas until the Age of Discovery, which is around the 1400s, because of Columbus's discovery of the New World, and everybody was separated on one half of the world versus the other half of the world. And so all of the early history that we learn about in class has a lot to do with Europe, Asia, and Africa, because we had no idea anybody was living in the Americas in the first place. Foraging societies are small groups and clans. They're still mobile. They still have to move because they have to be flexible with the climate and the food supply. If it's too warm, they move away from the equator. If it's too cold, they move closer to the equator. They want to be comfortable too. They also have to follow the food supply. So things like climate changes, disease, famine, which is a shortage of food, natural disasters, hurricanes, tornadoes, typhoons, other things like that, I'm trying to think, but I can't, could endanger or potentially eliminate entire communities altogether. And so it was for that reason, because of these natural disasters, that people really didn't build permanent shelters, because if they had to get up and move very quickly, you couldn't have a lot of possessions or worldly possessions. And so you have to just take what you can carry. Life expectancy was not great. The average life expectancy was about 22 years old, so most of you would have already been past middle age. You're welcome. Birth rates were really, really low, and that's because people were so mobile. Women had to move and get up quickly, with these migration types of movements or nomadic movements. And so birth rates were pretty low because women were constantly moving and it put a lot of strain on their pregnancies. So not very high fertility rates either. Pastoral societies were a little bit different. This included the domestication of animals. That is important because when you have domestication of animals, you now are keeping animals near or around the house. It doesn't literally mean in the house, just around the house, kind of like pets. But they used them for what they could produce. So things like eggs, milk, their skins, and their meat. Meat was a little bit harder because it would go bad very, very quickly. They hadn't figured out refrigeration systems yet. The extended family was extremely important to the group because that's pretty much the governing society at the time. It's patriarchal, male-dominated. Patriarchal comes from the Latin papa, so father is in charge. Women did have some rights. Men are the hunters, women are the gatherers. You have to be a contributing member of society to be considered valuable. So even though women had limited rights, they had rights. Most of these societies were considered egalitarian. So my Spanish speakers, egal looks like igual, which means same. Everybody is the same. Yes, there are gender roles, but nobody is more important than somebody else. And that's as far as in terms of gender. We'll get to social stratification in a minute. Like I said, they still had to be nomadic or mobile because they had to move with the animals. So the animals, again, have this sense about them. They know when bad things are going to happen, weather changes, and they need to also be fed. And so they have to follow the animals and go where the animals can find food. Going back to what I just said, social stratification. So social stratification has to do with pyramids in terms of who's important in these societies. And it really didn't have anything to do with gender. It was mostly on who was considered valuable to the group. And at the time, the more animals you had, the more valuable you were, the more power you had. So in this case, it was usually families that had the most animals were considered the most important, the most valuable. The first types of domesticated animals, animal, was the dog/wolf, aka man's best friend. The dog was used to warn against other predators. Goats were used for their milk and their meat. Cattle, chickens, horses, sheep, pigs were used for labor as well as food. Some negatives about the domesticating of animals. If not watched carefully, animals can overgraze, overeat, and eventually destroy the grass and the soil. That is because if you don't watch them, they can trample over the soil. If they're in one place for too long, that's negative because what it does is that the top layer of soil is the most nutrient-rich part of it, and so if they're constantly moving it and trampling it, it'll get washed away or taken away, and then it'll cause an infertilization of the land. So that's a negative. Picture we see there is a bull and a cow and a little baby cow. So we see like a family unit of these animals. That is because early civilizations, and when we talked about it in class, we said Egyptians because of the way that they look, probably figured out how to continuously breed these animals so they would have a constant source of supply from these animals. Agricultural societies are from about 8,000 BCE to about 3,000 BCE. This is important because now people are settling down. They have moved from nomadic to being a settled group of people. So we see the building of towns, the building of cities, and these are mostly small independent communities. They weren't linked a lot by travel or trade yet. They did have some limited communication with each other, but limited. When people figured out how to cultivate food, it was really important for them because it was a stable, reliable food source. As long as they had good soil, as long as they had a reliable water source, they could constantly or continuously grow a food supply that was beneficial to them and to their people and population rates. And so what it did is it allows them to be able to stay and settle in one area. They don't have to move anymore. And so now we also see the creation of cultural traditions, things that are important to people, things like art, writing, religion, belief systems, because people don't have to constantly pick up and go. They can have time to develop these other things that will become important uniquely to these societies. And usually it does also tie them to a piece of land, which is why they will not take kindly later to invaders coming in and trying to take their land away from them. Some early domesticated crops are wheat and barley in Southwest Asia, rice in Southeast Asia, millet in North China, and corn or maize in the Americas. And that meant that they learned how to specifically grow these crops in those particular areas. Now the positives is that it's beneficial to their diet and nutrition because they're eating better. These foods have more nutrients, which adds longevity to their life. Some negatives: when people got good at growing things, that was the only thing they wanted to grow. And so they killed basically, or the other crops died out because they weren't growing them and they weren't wild anymore. They're clearing the way for these specific crops to be grown over and over and over and over again. And so it is negative because The other crops that died out also lost or saw a loss of the insect and animal life that followed those other crops as well. But also, when you overfarm the land, when you constantly plant the same thing over and over, you remove the nutrients from the soil. Later, Europeans would figure out a rotation system in the feudal period, and they will rotate the crop so that the next season or the next harvest, is fertilized by a new type of product being introduced into the soil. They hadn't figured that out yet. And so these guys are constantly planting the same thing, and it removes the nutrients from the ground. Long-term consequences. I know I'm talking really fast, but I'm trying, guys. So long-term consequences. The previous life had forced them to forage or farm all day, and that's because, again, survival was key. Now that they can grow food, now that it's reliable, now that it's steady, you have a growing population, you have higher birth rates, you have longer life, you have better nutrition, lots of positives happening around the world. And so people have more time to do different things. We see the development of what is called specialization of labor. So people don't have to farm all day anymore. You have people who are farmers whose job it is to farm for the entire village. And so now other people can do other jobs like making tools, building cities. So early architects, engineers, organizing armies, and that's going to come in important in a minute, developing art, and even studying philosophy and religion. Organizing armies. That's important because as a result of agriculture, people needed to develop a way to protect what was important to them. So you're a farmer, you're great at your job, you have an awesome harvest, ready for picking, I guess you can kind of say. Your neighbor sees this, he's not so great at his job, he's jealous of you, he wants to take what's yours. How do you protect what's yours? And so you have the creation and the development of these organized types of militia or small soldier little factions that protect what is valuable to them. And so that will also become important later. So we see these groups move from very, very rudimentary, basic types of don't die attitude to now forming societies, actual societies that have politics, they have rulers, they have leaders, they have priests, you have organized religion, rituals, very elaborate rituals dedicated to serving the gods. And then you have a social hierarchy, which places value on people who are more important to the society based on what they can contribute to the group. So some pictures, lastly, of the specialization of labor. It's pretty evident there. You guys can see who's important, who's in the top, who's in the middle, who's in the bottom. Early forms of writing were pretty much just to record taxes. So it was about money, who owed money to who. The Neolithic Revolution shows you a social pyramid there. Rulers and priests, nobles, artisans and merchants, farmers and slaves. If you were in China, however, farmers and merchants would be flipped. That is because in China, the farmers were more important. Farmers actually provide food and they're essential to daily life versus merchants and artisans who just sell stuff, so they're not as important in terms of Asian or Chinese society. The impact on the environment long term is that farming overall changed the layout of the land. People had to clear land, people had to create irrigation, people had to figure out ways in which they could construct these big elaborate farms to feed the people, but also create and construct large buildings and monuments to create cities and roads and other things like that. Roads would become important because they link cities for trade, and then animals are now being used for labor, not just food. And so you have the early creation of a plow, which also helps increase farming, which makes these cities and these towns bigger because you have, again, more population. The Bronze Age, lastly, is marked by people discovering and creating metallurgy, essentially. When you combine copper and tin, you can make bronze, and bronze is a much stronger metal than was previously existed, and so that also allows the way for better tools, which makes or paves the way for warfare, because now these societies are going to compete with each other and they will go to war with each other for resources, and so the bronze does give them the advantage. So we'll talk about more tomorrow. Your last thing is your exit ticket. It's also up on Google Classroom. Remember to use ACE, strategies we've used all year. I look forward to hopefully getting some feedback from you guys. I know this was our first time doing this. If you saw the videos or lessons on Google Classroom, awesome. If this is your first time watching it, cool also. I'm really nervous, so hopefully it works out. And if you have any questions, always email me, reach out to me. Miss you guys, stay safe, and I can't wait to see you again. Bye.